10 minutes. That's all Jerome Powell had left before walking into the most consequential Federal Reserve meeting of his career. 10 minutes to decide whether he would be remembered as the Fed chairman who preserved American monetary independence, or the one who surrendered it to political pressure that had been building for months. The choice before him was stark and unforgiving. Raise interest rates to combat inflation that was silently destroying middle-class purchasing power, potentially triggering the recession that would cost millions their jobs, or maintain accommodative policy to protect employment while allowing inflation to accelerate toward levels that could destabilize the entire economic system. The handwritten note on his desk bore no signature, no letterhead, just 4 words in block letters: "It's too late, Jerome." Someone had slipped it under his office door sometime after midnight. His security detail found no traces of entry, no camera footage, nothing. But the message was clear enough to make his hand shake as he reviewed his prepared remarks one final time. But the real decision wasn't about monetary policy anymore. It was about whether the Federal Reserve would remain an independent institution or become another tool of political administration. And with 8 minutes left until the meeting began, Powell knew that whatever choice he made would define not just his legacy, but the fundamental nature of American monetary policy for decades to come. His secure phone displayed 17 missed calls from the White House Chief of Staff. The president had made his preferences abundantly clear during their heated conversation the previous evening. Jerome, unemployment is political suicide. Inflation is just numbers on a screen. You know what needs to happen here. The pressure wasn't subtle anymore. Congressional leaders had publicly questioned Fed independence. Treasury officials had suggested that coordination between fiscal and monetary policy was necessary for national economic security. Even members of his own Federal Open Market Committee were wavering under political pressure that went far beyond anything they'd experienced in their careers. His deputy knocked and entered without waiting for permission. "Jerome, we have a problem. Senator Warren's office just released a statement calling for your resignation if you raise rates." Senator Cotton's office responded by demanding rate increases to combat inflation. "You're getting attacked from both sides simultaneously." Powell walked to his window overlooking Constitution Avenue, watching early morning commuters heading to work in government buildings, where decisions were increasingly driven by political calculation rather than economic analysis. These people trusted that the Federal Reserve would protect the value of their savings, their paychecks, their retirement plans. They had no idea that the institution charged with that responsibility was facing an existential crisis. 7 minutes. Powell wasn't surprised. Political polarization had reached the point where any decision would be characterized as partisan by one side or the other. The Federal Reserve's traditional role as a technocratic institution above political battles was becoming impossible to maintain. Split expectations. Bond markets are pricing in a hold, equity markets are pricing in a cut, precious metals are pricing in a significant raise. There's no consensus because there's no good option. What's the market expecting? Meanwhile, unemployment remained near historic lows, but job quality was declining as employers struggled with labor costs that inflation was making unsustainable. Real wages were falling for most Americans even as job statistics suggested a strong labor market. Powell knew the data by heart. Inflation was running at 3.2% officially, but real inflation experienced by average families was closer to 6% when measured by essential goods like food, energy, and housing. Housing costs had risen 28% in 3 years. Grocery prices were up 24%. Energy costs had increased 31%. The Federal Reserve's dual mandate of price stability and full employment had become contradictory in an environment where maintaining employment required accepting inflation levels that undermined long-term economic stability. Powell understood the reference. In 1979, Fed Chairman Paul Volcker had raised interest rates to unprecedented levels to break the inflation spiral that was destroying American economic competitiveness. The decision triggered a severe recession, cost millions of jobs, and generated political pressure that nearly ended his tenure. But it also preserved the dollar's credibility and established the Federal Reserve's reputation for monetary discipline that had supported American prosperity for decades. 6 minutes. The encrypted message on his secure tablet came from a source he'd never expected, a former Fed chairman who'd faced similar pressures decades earlier. "Jerome, Some decisions define not just your tenure, but the institution itself. Choose the hard path that preserves independence over the easy path that compromises it. History will judge you not on short-term outcomes, but on whether you protected the Fed's ability to make difficult decisions. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "Whatever you decide, I'm proud of the integrity you've shown. The country needs leaders who make hard choices based on what's right, not what's popular." 5 minutes. Now Powell faced a similar choice in a much more politically charged environment. Social media amplified every criticism instantaneously. Congressional hearings were televised theater. Presidential tweets could move markets before Fed officials could respond with careful analysis. The international community was positioning for American monetary policy to become increasingly political and therefore less reliable. If the Federal Reserve lost its credibility for independent decision-making, the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency could face challenges that no amount of military or economic power could address. But the immediate political pressure was overwhelming. The president's chief of staff had made it clear that Fed appointments required White House approval and that future appointments would consider policy coordination as a key qualification. The message was unmistakable: cooperate or be replaced with someone who would. Powell reviewed the intelligence briefing that had arrived from Treasury that morning. China had reduced its dollar reserves by another $47 billion in the previous month, while increasing gold purchases. Russia had liquidated $23 billion in Treasury securities. Even European allies were quietly diversifying their central bank reserves away from dollar-dominated assets. The economic data painted a picture of an economy under stress from multiple directions. Corporate debt had reached levels comparable to 2008, but with weaker underlying fundamentals. Consumer debt was at historic highs relative to income. Government debt service costs were approaching levels that absorbed significant portions of federal revenue, even with relatively low interest rates. 4 minutes. Powell realized he wasn't just making a monetary policy decision. He was choosing between preserving institutional independence that might cost him his position, or accepting political direction that would fundamentally alter the Federal Reserve's role in American governance. His economic training suggested that addressing inflation directly was the less damaging long-term choice, even if it created short-term pain. But his political instincts warned that short-term pain would generate pressure that could destroy the Fed's independence before long-term benefits could materialize. Powell understood that both choices carried enormous risks. The question was whether those risks would be borne immediately and visibly through unemployment, or gradually and less visibly through inflation that acted as a hidden tax on everyone who earned or saved in dollars. Raising rates would increase all these debt burdens simultaneously, potentially triggering defaults that could cascade through the financial system. But maintaining low rates would accelerate inflation that was already eroding the purchasing power of working families who couldn't afford rising costs of essential goods and services. The intercom crackled. "Mr. Chairman, the committee members are assembled. They're waiting for you." 3 minutes. Powell gathered his papers, knowing that the prepared remarks he'd spent weeks crafting might be irrelevant depending on what happened in the next few minutes. The Federal Open Market Committee meeting was supposed to be a collegial discussion of monetary policy options, but with political pressure at unprecedented levels, he wasn't sure how many committee members would prioritize economic analysis over political survival. The division wasn't just about monetary policy. It was about fundamental questions of governance in a democracy, where institutions designed to operate independently were increasingly expected to align with partisan political objectives. Powell paused outside the meeting room door, hearing the muted conversations of committee members who were grappling with the same impossible choice he faced. Some had privately expressed support for maintaining Fed independence, regardless of political pressure. Others had suggested that pragmatic cooperation with elected officials was necessary for the Fed's continued relevance. 2 minutes. Powell realized that his decision would signal to future Fed chairs, to international observers, and to financial markets whether the American Central Bank remained capable of making decisions based on economic analysis rather than political calculation. 1 minute. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any monetary policy decision he'd made during his tenure. This wasn't just about interest rates or inflation targeting. This was about whether the institutional foundations of American monetary policy would survive the political pressures of the current era. or find some middle path that satisfied no one while failing to address the fundamental challenges facing the American economy. He placed his hand on the door handle, knowing that when he walked into that room, he would be forced to choose between options that all carried enormous risks: raise rates and potentially trigger recession, while facing political attacks that could end his tenure, maintain current policy, and allow inflation to accelerate while preserving his position, but compromising the Fed's long-term credibility. Powell took a deep breath, thinking about the millions of Americans whose financial security depended on the Federal Reserve making decisions based on sound economic principles rather than political expedience. Retirees on fixed incomes being destroyed by inflation, working families struggling with rising costs, young people trying to build wealth in an environment where traditional savings were being eroded by monetary policies designed to support asset prices. The note on his desk had warned that it was too late. But Powell understood that it was only too late if he abandoned the principles that had guided Federal Reserve policy for decades. There was still time to make the right choice, even if it was the politically difficult one. As he opened the door to face the committee members who would help to determine the future of American monetary policy, Powell made his decision. He would recommend the course of action that preserved Fed independence and addressed inflation directly, regardless of the political consequences. 30 seconds.